Hello everyone, welcome back to my channel. And today we move to volume 2, also the same subject, demon possession, with a different detail of the story. The story today took place in Winfang Commune. In this story, we focused on two characters. The youngest uncle, named Uncle Dong, and the grandma of the family. Take your time to enjoy the story. Enjoy the scary and spooky and spine-chilling detail. I hope you have great time listening to this story. And now, let's go to the story.
Fury, the person who recounted this story, is now 20 years old. This is a story that his paternal family actually experienced firsthand. However, he is only retelling it based on what his relatives told him, as the event happened when he was only about 4 or 5 years old, so he doesn't remember the details clearly. According to Fury, the story took place in Wingfeng Commune, Wingshan District, Qinjiang Province. The family background has a few peculiar aspects. Fury's grandmother had 3 children. The eldest son is Fury's father. The second child is Uncle Third, his father's younger brother, and the 2 siblings are only 1 year apart in age. The strange part lies with the youngest son named Zeng. The unusual name Zeng, which literally means don't, will be explained later in the story. From now on I will call him Don't. What's especially odd is that although Uncle Don't is Fury's biological uncle, he is only 3 or 4 years older than Fury. This unusual age gap happened because back in the day, both of Fury's grandparents were government officials working at the local commune office. As some may recall, during the 1980s and 1990s, there was a strong national campaign for family planning in Vietnam. While it wasn't strictly enforced as law, the movement was heavily promoted through public posters bearing the well-known slogan, "Boy or girl, 2 children are enough." At the time, the Vietnamese government was strongly promoting a national campaign urging families not to have too many children, and to limit the number to 2. A 2-child family was considered the ideal model. Because both of Fury's grandparents worked as government officials, they were seen as exemplary citizens and strictly followed this policy. That's why, after giving birth to Fury's father and Uncle Third, they decided to stop having children altogether. This continued for more than 10 years, until Fury's grandmother was already in her mid to late 30s, but then something unexpected happened. She accidentally became pregnant with Uncle Don't. Fury was told that when his grandmother first began to notice unusual signs in her body, specifically a missed menstrual cycle, she became extremely anxious. In her heart, she silently prayed, "Please don't, oh please no, don't let me be pregnant now, people will laugh at me." She was deeply worried not only because of her age, but also because their family had always strictly followed the 2-child rule. Getting pregnant again at that stage felt like a scandal. Her fears grew even worse when the 2nd month passed with no sign of her period, and her belly began to show. It could no longer be hidden. At that point, it wasn't just her neighbors, relatives, and friends all started begging her not to give birth. They kept telling her, "Don't have the baby, please don't, you're too old, don't do it." Because of all the gossip and pressure from those around her, Fury's grandmother seriously considered terminating the pregnancy. The words "don't give birth" kept echoing over and over again in her mind. However, she and her husband soon found themselves in a moral and legal dilemma. By then, both of them were already over 40 years old and still working as government employees. They were well aware that under Vietnamese law at the time, abortion was strictly regulated. If they chose to keep the baby, they'd be going against the national campaign's ideals. But if they chose to terminate the pregnancy, they'd risk breaking the law. Fortunately, when they confided in some co-workers at the local government office, they received calm and understanding advice. Their colleagues explained, the family planning movement back then was mostly about raising awareness. The goal was to discourage families from having 5, 7, even 10 children, which often led to poverty, lack of education, and social strain. But it wasn't a rigid or compulsory law. On the other hand, abortion was illegal at the time. If caught, you could be prosecuted or even imprisoned. After hearing that, Fury's grandmother finally decided to keep the baby, and that memory of giving birth at that age stayed vivid in her mind for the rest of her life. Because she was older, the delivery was extremely risky. She gave birth naturally, but it was an exhausting and dangerous labor. At one point, she became so weak that she couldn't push anymore. The midwives had to urgently shout at her to keep going because if she didn't push in time, the baby could suffocate and die. During that life and death childbirth, there was only one thought echoing in Fury's grandmother's mind. "Please don't die, my child. Please don't let my baby die." She gritted her teeth and pushed with all the strength she had left. Finally, with a loud squelch, the baby was born safely. Mother and child both survived. Because of those unforgettable moments, when the baby's 1-month celebration arrived, people asked, "So what will you name him?" Without hesitation, the family decided, "Let's just name him Don't," and it seems fitting. And that's how the unique name of Uncle Don't came to be. But Uncle Don't wasn't just someone with an unusual name, he would later become the main character in the story we're about to tell. When he was just a few months old, the family also had a native Vietnamese dog with golden fur, which everyone in the countryside affectionately called Rocky. From then on, Don't and Rocky grew up together. They formed an inseparable bond. By the time Don't was about 4 or 5 years old, their friendship was so close that he could ride on Rocky's back like a little horse. By that time, Rocky was already 3 to 4 years old and had grown surprisingly large. Even though it was just a local village dog, for some unknown reason, its build was massive and strong like a German Shepherd. Rocky, the golden-furred dog, would often let Don't ride on his back, wandering joyfully through the neighborhood together like two playful children. Their bond grew so strong that they were like real brothers. Sometimes they even slept together like siblings. Everything went on peacefully, until a major turning point came. Around the time Don't was about 8 or 9 years old, and Fury, the storyteller, was just around 5 to 7, Fury's grandmother suddenly fell seriously ill. At that time, she was only in her early 50s, an age still considered relatively young and active in Vietnam, certainly not frail or elderly. But strangely, illness after illness began to strike her down. For an entire year, she went in and out of hospitals, battling one sickness after another. Things took a sharp turn for the worse near the end of the year, around November, with just a couple of months left before Tet, the Lunar New Year. By then, her health had completely collapsed. She could no longer walk and was left bedridden, completely drained of strength. The family took Grandma to major hospitals in Saigon, such as Cho Ray Hospital and 115 Hospital. But unfortunately, the doctors could do nothing more. They diagnosed her with a degenerative condition related to old age. Her internal organs were severely deteriorated. The doctors explained that keeping her in the hospital would only waste money, as there was no chance of recovery. Instead, they suggested bringing her home so she could spend her final days surrounded by her loved ones. They estimated that she might only survive for a few more months. This news devastated the entire family. At just over 50 years old, her passing was considered premature, not the natural end of an elderly life. When she returned home, relatives and neighbors came by often to visit. For about 2 to 3 weeks she remained bedridden, and her condition grew weaker by the day. In her final 2 days, there was always someone by her side, taking turns caring for her both day and night. Neighbors, aunts, cousins, and close family friends helped stay up overnight to watch over her. Each morning, Fury's parents would ask the night caretakers, "How was last night? Did Mom sleep at all? Was everything okay?" And each time they replied, "No, she didn't sleep at all last night." Hearing this, they asked again, "Why not? What happened?" The caregiver replied, "Oh, I told her to try and sleep, I really did, but she just wouldn't. She kept staring wide-eyed, looking around constantly." The family was puzzled, wondering why no one had encouraged her to rest at her age. Sleep was so precious, especially with her health failing fast. But the caregiver explained, "We did. We asked her to close her eyes many times, but she wouldn't listen." They recalled that Grandma's eyes stayed wide open all night. Her gaze would shift around the room, sometimes fixed on the ceiling, other times looking out the window, since her bed was placed in the main room right next to a large window for fresh air, and from time to time her eyes would turn toward the front door. But it didn't stop there. She also kept trying to lift her hand to point outside. However, according to the caregiver, she was already too weak to fully raise her arm like a healthy person. All she could manage was a slow, trembling movement of her hand, her index finger extended, shaking slightly, pointing outward toward the door. The strange thing was, even though there were several young, healthy people in their teens, 20s, or 30s watching over her with clear eyesight, none of them saw anything, not a single soul. They couldn't understand how Grandma, who had been bedridden for weeks with blurred vision and eyes constantly gummed with discharge, could be seeing something that they, with their perfect eyesight, simply could not. For 2 full days, the same strange behavior continued, but nothing more frightening happened. Then, by midday on the 3rd day, Grandma quietly closed her eyes, took her final breath, and passed away. Her passing was gentle and peaceful. There were no signs of pain, no groaning, no struggling or gasping for air. It felt as if she had simply dozed off for an afternoon nap, slipping quietly into eternal rest. Since the family had already had 3 to 4 months to mentally prepare, though they were heartbroken, no one wailed or cried out loud. They simply sat there, eyes welling up with quiet tears. Then, without delay, they began preparing for the funeral. They called someone to deliver the coffin, set up the ceremonial tent, and started making all necessary arrangements. Shortly after, a funeral monk was invited to perform the rites. After examining Grandma's birth year, date, and time of death, he made a specific request. He explained, "Although she passed away around 1 or 2 p.m., you must wait until exactly 9 p.m. tonight to begin the anointing ritual, the process of washing and dressing the deceased." He said that depending on a person's age and the hour of their passing, there is a specific spirit hour for the anointing meant to avoid bad omens or unfortunate consequences for the family. That meant Grandma's body would remain there untouched for roughly 7 hours. About an hour after her passing, the coffin was delivered and placed in the living room. Its lid was left open, waiting until the proper hour to begin the ritual. While waiting for the ceremonial hour, the family began preparing Grandma's body for the funeral rites. They laid her on a reclining canvas chair, invited someone to apply makeup, changed her into a fresh set of clothing, and placed a chanting machine nearby to recite Buddhist sutras. Everything was arranged so that her image would appear peaceful and dignified. At that time there were about 4 or 5 people present. Among them was the makeup artist, a woman who specialized in preparing the deceased. She had been doing this since she was a young girl. Now in her late 40s or early 50s, she had known the family for a long time and considered Grandma like an older sister. She came to help without asking for any payment. Everyone knew her as someone honest and straightforward, never the type to lie or exaggerate. Around 3:30 to 4 p.m., after finishing dressing Grandma in new clothes, she began applying makeup. Once she was done, as she was packing up her kit, the family noticed something unusual. Her hands and legs were trembling uncontrollably. Her expression looked odd. There was something off about her demeanor. After putting everything away, she suddenly made an even stranger gesture. At that point, Grandma's hair had already been washed, combed, and neatly tied. Her head was bare, uncovered by any cloth. The makeup artist slowly lifted her hand as if intending to touch Grandma's head. But then she didn't. She simply hovered her hand in midair just above the surface of Grandma's scalp, trembling, frozen, unable to bring herself to touch it. Her hand stayed there, suspended only inches away from the skin, but she never made contact. As she stood there trembling, the makeup artist softly murmured, her voice shaking, "Please, please, dear sister, may your spirit be at peace, may you protect us from the other side." But it didn't sound like a normal farewell or blessing. Her voice was filled with fear, almost like she was begging. Immediately afterward, she hurried out of the house, her footsteps unusually fast, and walked straight back to her home without saying a single word about what had happened. The truth only came to light later, when a neighbor who lived next door to the makeup artist came over to pay respects at the wake. They casually mentioned, "We passed by your place earlier and saw you just got back. Was it crowded over at the funeral? Did you do her makeup nicely?" That's when the makeup artist, Mrs. Tu, finally revealed the terrifying experience she had just endured. She told the neighbor that while she was applying makeup, she had clearly seen the lips of the corpse move. She added that when doing makeup for the deceased, you have to sit very close since the body is lying completely still, unable to move or sit up. That's why she was certain about what she saw. The lips moved unmistakably. Not a twitch, not a muscle spasm, but an intentional motion as if the dead were about to say something. The woman sat very close to the body so she could carefully carry out her work. As she was working around the nose and mouth area, a terrifying thing happened. She saw Grandma's lips begin to move slightly, the motion lasting for about 3 to 4 seconds. The lips parted slightly by about 1 or 2 centimeters, then closed again as if trying to say something, even though no sound came out at all. The sight shocked her to the core. She jumped back in fear. At first she tried to laugh it off, thinking perhaps Grandma's spirit was just playing a trick on her. She even jokingly muttered, "Come on sis, lie still, if you keep moving the makeup's going to smear and crack the base layer." After the lips stopped moving and everything seemed quiet again, she continued working, moving on to Grandma's forehead. That's when it happened again. She saw Grandma's eyes slowly begin to open, not wide, not staring, just slightly, a narrow slit, just enough to reveal both the whites and the pupils underneath. And then, she saw it clearly. The pupils shifted, looking left to right, and then closed again. This horrifying sequence repeated exactly 3 times. She was utterly terrified because everyone knows that when a person dies, their pupils become cloudy and no longer react to light. That's why doctors often check for death by pulling back the eyelids and shining a light. For a dead body to move its eyes like that, to intentionally glance from side to side, is something that should be utterly impossible. What terrified her even more wasn't just the eye movement itself, but the nature of the eyes she saw. She firmly insisted that although the eyelids had opened only slightly, the eyes inside were not dull or clouded like those of the dead. On the contrary, they looked full of life, clear and vivid. She could see, plain as day, Grandma's pupils slowly shift to the left and slowly back to the right before the eyes closed again. And this exact movement happened 3 full times. By then she had completely lost her composure. Just as she finished the last touches of makeup, her body was shaking uncontrollably from fear. As she hurried to pack her tools, she kept whispering over and over again, "Please, dear sister, may your spirit be peaceful. May your soul protect us from the afterlife." Later, she shared what she saw with a neighbor, and the story soon made its way to the grieving family at the funeral. Immediately, the guests split into two camps. One group was angry. They believed she was lying, making up a horrifying story at the worst possible time while the family was still in mourning. They pointed out that she and Grandma had been very close in life, so why would she say such a thing now? But the other group came to her defense. They argued that Mrs. Two had always been honest, and that her job doing makeup for the dead was a sacred and respectable task. There was no reason for her to lie, especially at a moment like this. Some believed that perhaps she really had seen what she claimed to see. In the end, whether people believed her or not, they had no choice but to set the story aside and focus on making sure the funeral was carried out properly and with respect. According to the family's plan, the anointing ritual, the act of cleansing and dressing Grandma's body before placing her into the coffin, was scheduled to take place at 9 p.m. So by 8 p.m. the preparation ceremony began. A Buddhist monk had arrived to chant prayers, and the family had already prepared several trays of offering food. At this point, the atmosphere in the house was both solemn and heavy with fatigue. Many family members had stayed awake through the previous night, so everyone looked completely exhausted. Grandma had a large extended family with over 10 grandchildren present. They all sat in neat rows according to age and status. The elder relatives sat in the front, the younger ones in the back. Among them was a distant aunt, a woman already in her 60s, but still considered younger in status than Grandma, so she sat in the front row. She looked extremely tired, almost on the verge of dozing off. The rhythmic chant of the monk's voice, soft and melodic, Amitabha Buddha, only intensified her drowsiness. The others in the room could see clearly. Although her hands were still pressed together in prayer, her whole body had slumped forward and her head kept nodding off, swaying with the weight of sleep. Then suddenly, just past 8 p.m., while Grandma's body was still lying there in the open, that distant aunt jerked awake with a start. She didn't say a word, but her eyes were locked on the body. Suddenly she jerked upright, her posture stiffened, and her eyes bulged wide open, staring straight ahead. Everyone around her was startled and asked, "What's wrong?" She turned toward them, her voice panicked. Did any of you see that?" When people looked at her confused, she said, "I swear I just saw her hand move." Her words caused a ripple of unease across the room. Some assumed she was just joking, or maybe so exhausted and drowsy that she imagined it. Even she tried to calm herself down. "Maybe I was just half asleep, just dreaming nonsense." Then she stood up, sweat dripping from her forehead, and walked straight outside. But it didn't stop there. A short while later, another relative, a woman in her 40s, the younger sister-in-law of Grandma, was sitting quietly, chanting along with the monk. She had been completely alert, sitting upright, calmly reciting the sutras. Suddenly she let out a sharp curse, a startled reflex that's common in the countryside when someone is spooked. Everyone turned to look, she explained, her voice trembling. I just saw Grandma's leg twitch." Terrified, she too stood up and hurried outside. Panic spread even more when yet another person claimed to have witnessed something. This time they insisted they had seen Grandma's stomach rise and fall as if she were still breathing. They pointed to the bunch of green bananas that had been placed on her stomach and claimed it was visibly bobbing up and down in rhythm as if moved by something beneath. In total, 3 or 4 people ended up leaving the room, too afraid to stay. But it still wasn't over. Yet another person, while sitting in prayer, suddenly gasped and swore that they saw Grandma's head move slightly. Just a faint movement, barely a tilt, but enough to send them rushing outside in fear. Now that 4 different people had claimed to witness strange occurrences, the atmosphere in the house became increasingly tense and divided. Some believed what was happening. Others remained skeptical. Regardless of what anyone believed, 9 p.m. finally arrived, the scheduled time for the anointing ritual. The task was handed over to the burial team, a group of professionals who specialized in preparing the dead for burial. They began performing specialized rites, such as lining the bottom of the coffin with dry tea leaves, rituals unfamiliar to the average person. As the morticians worked, the family sat quietly below, hands clasped in prayer, unable to hold back their tears. The moment when Grandma's body was placed into the coffin was filled with grief and sorrow. Cries of "Ma, Grandma" echoed through the room. But amidst the heartbreak, some began to notice something strange. 2 or 3 members of the burial team kept whispering to one another. Their faces had turned ashen, and they were constantly wiping sweat from their brows. Their eyes were wide, filled with visible fear. Once the body was secured inside the coffin, the morticians stepped aside to allow the family to come forward for a final farewell. But even as they stood off to the side, they continued huddling together, whispering in low, anxious tones. At that moment, a line of more than 10 family members was slowly forming, each waiting to pay one final look at Grandma before the coffin was closed. Among them, a few people standing close to the morticians began whispering among themselves. One person leaned over to the next and murmured, "Hey, did you see her eyes open just now?" Another immediately responded, sounding unsettled. "When I touched her hand, I swear it felt like her finger lightly brushed against my palm." Then a third person chimed in. "Yeah, I saw her eyes slightly open too, and her lips, they were moving like that." 3 or 4 members of the burial team all confirmed seeing something strange. Their whispers quickly reached the ears of the family. Mom and dad, aunts and uncles, everyone who heard it became deeply disturbed. What made things worse was the fact that the morticians were known for being serious, never the type to joke around, especially at a moment like this. That made the fear even more real. A quiet, creeping sense of dread settled into everyone's mind. After everyone had finished saying their goodbyes, the team began preparing to seal the coffin just as scheduled. But at that moment, one of the family members spoke up. "Wait, don't close it just yet. Let's wait until tomorrow morning." The decision was made for 2 reasons. Some close relatives were still on their way from the city and hadn't arrived in time. The next morning, local officials and representatives from the commune would come to pay respects. Grandma had been a longtime Communist Party member, having joined as a teenager during the war and devoted her life to the community. Everyone agreed. The coffin would stay open through the night. Time passed, and then at around 11 p.m. something happened that no one could have imagined. In the stillness of the night, as everything had gone quiet, Grandma suddenly woke up. The first person to witness it was a maternal aunt from the family. The night had grown late. After a long day of grief and exhaustion, and having already mentally prepared themselves, many family members had gone to bed. But one of the aunts, known for never being able to sit still, was still quietly cleaning and tidying around the house. Suddenly she let out a shrieking scream, then rushed around the house, banging on doors and waking everyone up. As people scrambled out of their rooms asking what had happened, she cried out in panic, I heard her moaning from inside the coffin." Her words were met with skepticism and even a bit of irritation, especially from Fury's father, who, as the head of the family, refused to believe in such superstitions. He didn't want his mother, who had just passed away, to be the subject of talk or rumors about hauntings. Seeing that no one believed her, the aunt insisted, "No, I swear it's true, I really heard it." Faced with her certainty, about 5 or 6 family members decided to go check it out together. And when they approached the coffin, they all froze in place. There was no mistake. A moaning sound was clearly coming from inside. Fear swept through the group. Children who were nearby, terrified, scattered to hide. As the adults approached the coffin, since it was placed quite high, they had to stand on their toes to look inside. And then they saw something unbelievable. Grandma was alive. Her eyes were open and her whole body was shaking violently, as if caught in a terrible chill. At first, everyone stood frozen in shock. But in the Mekong Delta, stories of the dead coming back to life, a phenomenon known as returning spirit, aren't entirely unheard of. So once the initial panic passed, it was quickly replaced by a wave of overwhelming love and relief. Trembling voices called out, "Ma, is that you, Ma?" "Aunt Seventh, can you hear us?" Grandma responded with a slight nod. Immediately, the family called the morticians back in. They carefully lifted Grandma out of the coffin and gently laid her back down onto the reclining bamboo chair. All throughout the night, her body continued to shiver uncontrollably. Family members could only dab a bit of water on her dry lips to keep her comfortable. Word of the miracle spread like wildfire. Despite the late hour, neighbors poured in from all directions. Some came out of fear, but many came with joy and awe. They believed it to be a blessing, a divine act of mercy, a reward from the Buddhas and Bodhisattvas for Grandma's lifetime of good deeds and kindness. The sorrow of the funeral suddenly transformed into a scene of wonder and celebration. The family decided not to move Grandma back into her bedroom just yet. First, they had to cancel the funeral plans and return the coffin that had already been prepared. News of Grandma's miraculous return spread far and wide, and what followed was nothing short of extraordinary. Even the funeral home, upon learning that Grandma had worked for the local commune, gladly took back the coffin and refunded the family in full. As for the burial team, they too were overjoyed. Not a single person mentioned wages or service fees. Everyone agreed, "We got stood up by the dead, but in the best way possible." No one felt upset, only relieved and thankful. The family quickly dismantled everything. Tents, candles, offerings, all items related to the funeral were taken down and put away. By the next morning, the house had returned to normal as if nothing had happened. At that point, Grandma was resting quietly on a bamboo daybed. In the first 24 hours, she lay there, moaning softly. When spoken to, she didn't respond. She could only sip small spoonfuls of water fed to her by family members. On the second day, she finally began eating again. Signs of life were becoming more and more visible. Her hands and feet began to regain a healthy pinkish hue, but she could only eat porridge, and only if it was blended to a near liquid state. Fortunately, blenders were available by then, so the family would blend the porridge until it was smooth and feed it to her slowly, 1 spoon at a time. And so Grandma remained alive for a full week. She never left the bamboo bed. She was fed and cared for gently day by day. But during that entire time, she didn't say a word. And it was in this very week that the story truly begins, one that involved the youngest uncle. After Grandma came back to life, Uncle Don't, though he had cried like everyone else, quickly returned to his usual playful self, spending his days with his beloved dog, Rocky. But something strange began to happen. It wasn't Uncle Don't who changed, it was the dog. Rocky, who had always been a free spirit running joyfully around the village, suddenly began to behave very differently. The change only came at night. Every evening, Rocky would stand in the front yard, face toward Grandma, and bark furiously non-stop. It never tried to bite or attack, but its barking was wild and unsettling, echoing loudly into the quiet of the night. This unusual behavior went on for 3 or 4 nights, driving the entire household to their limits. Some believed the dog was just growing old. It was about 9 or 10 years old by then, and that maybe its mind was beginning to slip. Eventually, the family decided to tie it up out back, hoping to get some peace and quiet. But that only made things worse. Now that it was restrained, Rocky no longer barked. Instead, every night it would let out a long mournful howl like "oh, oh," filled with sorrow and eeriness. The sound sent chills through everyone who heard it. Back in the village at that time, another strange phenomenon was happening. Every time Rocky the dog let out a howl, all the other dogs in the neighborhood would join in, creating a chorus of eerie barking that echoed through the night. As for Uncle Don't, he was around 9 or 10 years old at the time, a lively boy, always running around the village. Most nights he wouldn't come home until 8 or 9 p.m., wandering back on his own, often barefoot. By then, Grandma was still very weak. It was my father and mother, her daughter-in-law, who had been taking care of her full-time. And since Don't was so young, they also helped him bathe and put him to bed every night. One evening, Uncle Don't came home late again. But instead of heading to his own sleeping area, he walked straight into my father's room. Startled, Dad snapped at him. "What time do you think it is? It's late. Why aren't you in bed?" But this time, Uncle Don't didn't joke around. He replied in a strangely serious tone, "Big brother, when I passed by Grandma's bed just now, she called me. She told me to come to her." My father frowned and shook his head in disbelief. "That's nonsense. Grandma's been sick for days. She hasn't said a single word. There's no way she called you." But Uncle Oot was insistent. "No, she really did. She even said, 'Son, come here, son, come here, I need to tell you something.' That's exactly what she said." Even then, my father didn't believe him. Annoyed, he scolded, "Stop lying, you're always making up stories. Now go to your room and sleep." But Uncle Don't refused to go. That night, Uncle Don't was so frightened that he begged to sleep next to Fury, the narrator. Since the two were close in age, more like brothers than uncle and nephew, the family agreed. But oddly enough, the next morning, everything seemed normal. Uncle Don't was back to his usual carefree self, laughing and playing throughout the day. And by evening he returned to sleep in his own room as if nothing had happened. However, just a night or two later, the fear came back, stronger than ever. This time, Uncle Don't finally explained why. He said that on the nights he stayed out late, around 9 or 10 p.m., he had to walk past the living room where Grandma still lay resting alone. And that's when he heard her call him, "Son, come here, son, I love you so much. Come here and let me bite you, just one little bite, come let me bite you." That sentence shocked the entire family. Not because of what he said, but because no one believed it could be true. Grandma hadn't been able to speak clearly for days. How could she possibly say a full sentence like that? And more importantly, "Let me bite you," that didn't make any sense. If she had really spoken, surely she would have said something like, "Let me kiss you," not bite. So no one believed Uncle Don't. They thought he was either mistaken or making it up entirely. From that night on, Uncle Don't was too afraid to enter the house from the front. Instead, whenever he came home late, he would always sneak in through the back door, just to avoid walking past the spot where Grandma still lay. About 4 or 5 days later, another horrifying incident took place. That evening, perhaps out of fear of thieves or simply by coincidence, Fury's mother had locked the back door of the house. Around 9 or 10 p.m., Uncle Don't came home from playing. As usual, he circled around to the back entrance only to find it locked shut. With no choice, he turned and headed toward the front entrance, right past the spot where Grandma's body still lay. Just as he stepped onto the front porch, the house, which is quiet with everyone asleep, was shattered by a blood-curdling scream. Everyone jumped awake. They saw Uncle Don't running and crying, racing down toward the kitchen, gripping one hand tightly with the other, blood dripping from his fingers and screaming in pain, "It hurts, it hurts." Everyone rushed over in panic. "What happened? What's going on?" Through his sobs and gasps, he screamed out, "Grandma bit me, Grandma bit me." Everyone froze. "What? Grandma's lying still. How could she bite you?" Don't was trembling, refusing to let anyone see his hand. My father, now growing suspicious and angry, snapped, "Stop lying. Let me see your hand, open it now." Reluctantly, Uncle Don't slowly loosened his grip, and what everyone saw made them gasp in disbelief. Right there on his palm was a full human bite mark. But it wasn't just any bite. We could clearly make out the impressions of every single tooth, as if from a complete adult set around 30 teeth in total. And more terrifying still, 4 or 5 of them had dug in so deep they had torn the skin, leaving blood oozing from open wounds. The bite marks had sunk deep into the flesh, with several sharp points piercing through, causing bright red blood to gush out. When everyone demanded to know what had happened, Uncle Don't, sobbing and trembling, could only cry, "It was Ma, Ma bit me." Through frightened tears he recounted what had just happened. Earlier that night he tried to enter through the back door only to find it locked. Left with no other way in, he was forced to take the front route, which led directly past the living room where Grandma's body was resting. The hallway was tight and narrow, so when he passed by he was barely a meter away from her. He saw her hand waving at him, beckoning him to come closer. But overcome with fear, he kept walking quickly, eyes averted. That's when it happened. Grandma suddenly lunged forward, grabbed his hand, and bit down. Hearing this, Fury's father immediately dismissed the story. Nonsense, she's been lying there still all this time. But despite his skepticism, he still took garlic, crushed it into a paste, and gently cleaned and dressed the wound. As he tended to his little brother's hand, a seed of doubt began to grow in his mind. Yes, Don't was mischievous, but he wasn't clever or crafty enough to lie with such vivid detail. Determined to see for himself, Fury's father headed toward the living room. When he arrived, he saw his mother seemingly asleep, her eyes closed, the room dimly lit by flickering altar lamps. He walked over, reached out, and flipped on the light. As the brightness filled the room, he leaned in to look at her face, and what he saw next froze him to the core. Right at the corner of her lips and streaked along her chin were fresh smears of blood, not dried blood. Not old stains, fresh, bright red, warm. His little brother's blood. A chilling wave of dread washed over him. His body broke out in goosebumps. The truth hit him like a thunderclap. Grandma had bitten Don't, and she wasn't entirely gone. Immediately after witnessing the blood on his mother's lips, Fury's father rushed to his wife and told her everything. By the next morning, the terrifying story had spread like wildfire. Whispers filled the air, all centered around one chilling conclusion. Grandma had been possessed by what locals called corpse possession, a malevolent spirit that enters a body prepared for burial. At first, the family believed the reason might be simple. The coffin had been left open all day, waiting for local officials and comrades to arrive and pay respects. Typically, the lid would be closed, sealed with protective talismans. But this time it had remained open, exposed. They speculated that a wandering spirit passing by during this window had slipped in and taken control. But as they pieced together the strange occurrences, the truth began to feel much darker. This wasn't just some random spirit. This thing had been watching and waiting. They remembered the makeup artist's story, how she'd seen Grandma's mouth move, how her eyes opened and shifted multiple times. They recalled what the aunts and cousins witnessed during the chanting, her hands twitching, her stomach rising and falling, as if someone or something was breathing inside her. And most disturbing of all, those final days before death, when Grandma had pointed outside repeatedly, her eyes locked on something unseen, as if she knew it was already there, lurking, waiting for her to weaken. To confirm their suspicions, the family decided to conduct a simple test. That afternoon, during one of her most lucid moments, a group of 5 or 6 family members gathered near Grandma's bed. First, Fury's father gently asked, "Ma, do you remember me?" Grandma nodded. Then his wife asked the same, another nod. Each close relative asked, and Grandma responded correctly. But when it was the turn of more distant family members, a cousin and in-law, they stepped forward and softly asked, "Kai Bei, do you remember me?" That's when everything changed. Grandma's eyes went wide. She froze and her body began to tremble. She didn't respond, she couldn't. The room fell silent. Everyone stared at her, horrified. It was as if someone had exposed the imposter. From that moment on, the family was convinced. The spirit inside her only recognized those it had heard being spoken about during the days it possessed her body. But when asked about someone less mentioned, it had no idea who they were, and it couldn't fake it. When Grandma failed to recognize the distant relatives, the family's fear reached its breaking point. They were now fully convinced that something dark was controlling her body, and it only recognized those it had eavesdropped on while inside her. That belief grew stronger when they looked again at the bite wound on little Uncle Don't's hand. Not only had it failed to heal, but it was now swollen, red, and severely inflamed. It was clear they couldn't wait any longer. In desperation, they ran to the nearby Buddhist temple, hoping to get help from the monk who had earlier performed Grandma's funeral rites. After hearing the full story, the monk agreed to come immediately. But according to Fury, this monk wasn't exactly a powerful exorcist or spiritual master. Still, he did what he could. After observing Grandma's condition, he gave the family one final solution. From this point on, he said, everyone must sincerely recite the Dharani of great compassion and combine it with this powerful mantra, Om Mani Padme Hum. He explained that this sacred phrase held immense spiritual force, even stronger than the Dharani, and could strike fear into the heart of any evil spirit. The monk stayed to guide them. That very afternoon around 1 or 2 p.m., more than 10 family members gathered in a circle. Together, they began to chant in unison. Their voices echoed through the house, filled with urgency, hope, and a deep trembling fear of the unknown. As the chanting session began, something strange happened. Unlike the typical stories of possessed bodies screaming or convulsing, Grandma didn't thrash, scream, or shake. She simply lay there, motionless. But what unsettled everyone was the sound of her breathing. Each breath was ragged, as if she were deeply exhausted. Every so often, she would let out a sharp exhale like a final gasp of air, and each time that gasp echoed through the room, the family would flinch, then intensify their chanting even more. The prayers continued for hours, all the way until around 5 or 6 p.m. Family members later recalled that during the final hour, the harsh exhaling sounds began to fade. Her breathing weakened slower and slower, until finally, around 5 p.m., everything fell completely silent. Just moments after that silence set in, a horrific stench began to fill the air. At first, some thought someone nearby had passed gas, but the smell didn't go away. Instead, it grew thicker and more overwhelming with each passing second. It was the unmistakable smell of decay. That's when the monk finally spoke up. "It's over," he said. "The spirit has finally left." He explained that it was this wandering spirit that had been keeping the body from decaying naturally. Now that it had departed, the body, which had been dead for several days, was beginning to decompose at an abnormally rapid rate. The monk then turned to the family and gently said, "Now, you must call the funeral home again. It's time to prepare for the real funeral, this time properly." Immediately, the family had to call back all the funeral services, the mortuary, tent rental, funeral band, and embalmers. Everyone on the other end was confused. "Didn't you just tell us she came back to life? Why are you calling again?" The family could only explain hurriedly. "She's gone, this time for real. Bring the casket now. Set up the tent right away. Get the embalmers, the monks, the musicians, quickly." The monk remained seated, continuing his ritual. But unlike before, there would be no delays this time. As soon as the new casket arrived, the body was quickly washed and dressed again, placed inside, and this time the lid was shut immediately. All the while, the monk chanted the great compassion mantra and Om Mani Padme Hum without pause. By around 6 p.m., everything was in place. The family announced the burial would take place the very next morning at the earliest auspicious hour, between 8 and 9 a.m. There would be no more waiting. The neighbors who rushed over after hearing the commotion were shocked. "Wait, what? She just came back to life? We were going to tell everyone it was a miracle. What happened?" But the family kept their answers vague, trying to avoid panic. They decided to keep the truth hidden, that their beloved mother had been taken by something far more terrifying than just death. The family made a unanimous decision. They would keep the story of the possessed corpse completely secret. They believed the incident had been caught early, just as it began to manifest through the bite on Don't's hand, and before it could lead to any terrible consequences. But more importantly, they wanted to protect their grandmother's honor. In life, she was a respected woman, a senior official in the local commune. To claim that she had been possessed by an evil spirit after death would be too shameful, as they said. So to outsiders, they offered a simpler version of the truth. Grandma came back for a few days. It was a miracle, but then she passed peacefully, and the funeral was resumed as normal. But right after the burial, something else equally heartbreaking happened. No one knew whether it was a coincidence or something more ominous. That same night, after Grandma was laid to rest, the family once again heard the barking. Rocky, the family's loyal yellow-furred dog, was still tied behind the house, just as it had been during the previous strange days. Even though Grandma was truly gone now, no one had remembered to untie him. That night, his barking grew fiercer than ever. But this time it wasn't just barking. It was a chilling mix of howls and whimpers, long drawn-out moans of sorrow, echoing across the quiet night from behind the house, just 10 to 15 meters away from Grandma's new grave. And then, the next morning, when someone finally went to check on him, they found Rocky lying still, his body already stiff and lifeless. He had died during the night. No one knew when or why, but everyone knew that when dogs die, their bodies grow stiff, and that was exactly what they found that morning. A loyal companion, silent forever, his body rigid, facing the grave of the woman he once followed everywhere. Rocky's passing brought yet another sorrow to Don't, who was already grieving his mother. Now he had lost his closest childhood companion too, a pain he could hardly bear. Because Rocky had been with the family for so many years, they didn't have the heart to butcher him. Instead, they buried him carefully, as if he were truly part of the family. The sudden death of Rocky sparked whispers within the family and among neighbors. Many believed that after being exorcised from Grandma's body, the evil spirit had not truly left. It lingered, hovering in the air, watching from the shadows, waiting. But because the monk had stayed to chant prayers, the spirit had no chance to harm anyone in the house. Only Rocky, the unlucky dog, was left tied up behind the house, beyond the reach of the protective mantras and sacred chants. Some said that in its spiteful vengeance, The spirit had attacked the one creature that dared defy it. After all, Rocky had barked and howled every night during the days it possessed Grandma, a faithful sentinel warning of danger. And so, with the heart of a coward and the hatred of a beast, the spirit may have turned its fury on the dog, crushing its spirit in the dark of night and stealing its soul into the grave. Of course, these were just the stories passed from neighbor to neighbor, whispered under breath. The monk never confirmed anything, and no one could offer solid proof, but still, no one could ignore the uncanny timing. A dog once strong and healthy suddenly howling in agony, then dying cold and stiff on the very same night that Grandma was finally buried.
And that's the end of the story. Do you believe the story really exists? Follow my channel for more story and taboos you shouldn't break in your daily life. Are there any story like this happening in your country? Just let just let me know in the comment. Follow my channel for more story and some information about spiritual realm. Thanks for your watching and see you in the next story. Bye bye.